Okay, let's jump into this. We're taking a deep dive today into some really interesting and, frankly, quite heated territory.
Yeah, definitely.
Our source material tackles a specific argument made by Christian apologist John Lennox. It's an argument that draws a direct line between atheism and the horrors of historical totalitarian regimes.
And our mission here really is to walk you through exactly what that source material says. We're going to unpack how it describes Lennox's argument and then, explore its detailed critique of that argument.
Right.
It's all about understanding the perspectives presented within the single text. We're not adding our own takes here.
Exactly. The article we're working with is by Jorge Pires, PhD, titled The Godless Scapegoat: How John Lennox Uses Stalin to Discredit Atheism. So it's a very focused look at, a particular way of making a case against atheism.
Right. Pires describes Lennox as using what he actually calls a rhetorical playbook for this. According to Pires, the core argument Lennox deploys seems to follow a few distinct steps.
Okay, so step one, as Pires sees it, is defining atheism not just as simply not believing in God, but kind of elevating it to the status of a comprehensive worldview.
Mm-hmm. And then step two, this atheistic worldview, once it's defined in that broader sense, is deliberately linked and, conflated with historical totalitarian regimes. Names like Stalin, Mao, Pol Pot come up.
Which leads to step three, where the argument, as described by Pires, explicitly attributes the terrible atrocities committed by those regimes directly to their lack of belief in God. It makes the absence of belief the causal factor.
Yeah, the reason for it all. And Pires highlights how Lennox puts this argument into practice in various places. For instance, in debates. The article mentions one against Christopher Hitchens at the Oxford Union.
Yeah, the source notes a particular tactic there. Lennox will ask audiences to imagine a world without atheism, and the immediate picture he paints, according to Pires, is one filled with gulags, mass murder, state-controlled indoctrination.
Oh.
It's a powerful, almost visceral image, really designed to provoke a strong reaction,
Definitely. And the source mentions specific anecdotes Lennox uses, like a story from East Germany about a girl allegedly being denied higher education because she wouldn't pledge allegiance to what's presented as an atheistic regime.
Right.
Pires says Lennox frames this specific event as a form of intellectual murder.
Wow. The article also points out a distinction Pires says Lennox makes between soft atheists, mentioning someone like Richard Dawkins, and hard atheists, citing figures like Camus or Sartre.
And the implication Pires draws from this distinction is that the soft ones are painted as somewhat naive, like they've ditched religion but still want to keep its moral framework somehow, while the hard ones are positioned as, dangerous nihilists. Pires actually labels this distinction a false dichotomy in his critique.
Okay, so that gives us the shape of Lennox's argument, at least as it's analyzed by Pires in this article. Now, where does Pires start to pick this apart?
Well, Pires' critique is quite direct. He uses a pretty strong language to describe Lennox's approach, calling it things like intellectually dishonest, a manipulation, moral blackmail, even propaganda.
Wow. Yeah, those are some strong terms. What's the fundamental disagreement Pires has with this argument? What's the core issue?
At its core, Pires argues that atheism is fundamentally just a metaphysical position. It's simply about the absence of belief in gods. That's it.
Right.
It doesn't in itself prescribe a political system or an economic theory or a specific moral code. It's a single point of non-belief, not some comprehensive ideology dictating all aspects of life.
And this is where the article uses that very memorable analogy, isn't it? The one about Stalin's mustache?
Exactly. Pires writes, and I think it's worth quoting him here, Stalin also had a mustache. That doesn't make mustaches responsible for genocide.
Right.
His point is that correlation, the fact that Stalin was an atheist and a tyrant, doesn't automatically equal causation. Just because two things were present doesn't mean one caused the other.
Okay, that makes sense. It's a clear way to put it. So Pires directly challenges the idea that atheism itself inherently leads down the path to gulags and mass murder.
He does. He points to examples that seem to contradict that direct causal link. Pires brings up peaceful, democratic societies with large secular or atheist populations, countries like Norway, Sweden, the Netherlands, Japan.
Okay.
He implicitly asks, if atheism inevitably leads to such horrors, why haven't these countries experienced them? It's like they, as he might put it, missed the memo on the supposed atheism genocide link.
That's a good point. What about the idea that figures like Stalin represented an escape from religion? The argument often frames them as leaving behind belief, and that's why they were so terrible.
Yeah, Pires challenges that framing significantly. He argues that Stalin didn't actually escape religion. Rather, he kind of replaced one totalitarian system, which was rooted in the orthodox theocracy, with another form of state religion, communism itself.
So communism as a religion?
Pretty much. Pires describes Stalin's regime as functioning like a quasi-religious cult, complete with its own sacred texts, Marxist-Leninist writings, martyrs, rituals, and a worshipped figurehead in Stalin.
Right.
His point, as he writes it, is that Stalin mimicked religion, not escaped it.
So Pires sees Lennox's framing of this history as something other than purely philosophical or, historical analysis.
Absolutely. Pires characterizes Lennox's move as being strategic, not philosophical. He argues the primary goal is moral framing, basically, to associate atheism with ultimate evil in people's minds.
Okay.
It's presented as a fear appeal designed to make atheism seem inherently radioactive and terrifying, rather than providing a nuanced historical understanding of, let's face it, very complex events.
And Pires sees this tactic, this kind of association, used in other contexts, too.
Yes, he compares it to similar rhetorical shortcuts. Pires suggests it's comparable to, say, blaming Christianity for the Holocaust just because Hitler invoked God or had alliances with churches at times, or blaming Buddhism for Japanese war crimes during World War II, or pinning all terrorism solely on Islam. Pires argues these are all rhetorical shortcuts designed to provoke fear, not understanding, rather than engaging with the specific, complex factors at play in those historical events.
That comparison really highlights the pattern Pires is identifying. What about looking back at history from the other side? Does Pires address the history of religion itself in response to Lennox?
He does. He introduces the concept of moral amnesia in relation to Lennox's argument. Pires points out that Lennox, while making his case against atheism using these totalitarian examples, doesn't really dwell on the church's own historical record of aligning with oppressive regimes or, participating in atrocity.
And what kind of examples does Pires mention here? What's he referring to?
Well, Pires lists things like the church's historical involvement or support for slavery, colonization, the Inquisition, apartheid, anti-Semitism. Quite a list.
Yeah.
He argues Lennox avoids these examples because, from Pires' perspective, the argument is tribal. It's focused on moral branding, making one's own group look morally superior and the opposing group look inherently evil, rather than engaging in what Pires calls honest reflection on the historical complexities and, frankly, shortcomings of all belief systems.
He even brings in Christopher Hitchens' perspective on this specific point, doesn't he? About the Russian context.
He does. Pires mentions Hitchens' retort to Lennox on this very point, that the long tradition of religious obedience and submission cultivated by Russian Orthodoxy, for example, actually might have prepared the cultural ground for the kind of unquestioning servility that allowed Stalinism to flourish.
That's an interesting counterargument. That at the heart of Pires' critique, he identifies what he calls the core distortion. What is that exactly?
Pires sees the core distortion as this moral myth that Lennox is allegedly selling. The idea that belief in God is the only possible safeguard against barbarism and tyranny, and therefore disbelief inherently leads to it.
So it's presented as the only way.
According to Pires, yes. Pires argues this completely ignores the fact that values we associate with a just society, things like human rights, dignity, freedom, equality, can and clearly have arisen from human reason and secular ethical frameworks. He points again to those democratic, secular societies he mentioned earlier as evidence.
Okay, so how does Pires ultimately characterize Lennox's whole association of atheism with Stalinism? What's his final take?
His concluding assessment is quite blunt, really. Pires sees it primarily as a scare tactic. He suggests it's essentially a recycled form of Cold War propaganda, just adapted for contemporary debates about belief and non-belief.
Interesting framing. And what does Pires suggest history really teaches us about the causes of atrocities then, if it's not simply about belief or disbelief in God?
Well, Pires argues that history shows us atrocities have been committed by both religious and secular regimes. There's no monopoly there.
Right.
According to his analysis in the article, the common factor isn't the presence or absence of belief in God, but rather, and this is a key phrase he uses, dogma plus unchecked power.
Dogma plus unchecked power.
Yeah. It's when rigid ideology, whether it's religious or secular, combines with absolute authority that's unchecked by critical thinking, human rights, or any real accountability. That's when we see the worst historical outcomes.
And how does Pires suggest we actually avoid future atrocities? based on that understanding?
He concludes that avoiding future horrors requires fostering critical thinking, actively upholding human rights, and building strong institutional accountability. These are things, Pires argues, that can exist within both secular and religious worldviews, but only when those worldviews are fundamentally committed to human dignity, not ideology. That's the crucial part for him.
Wow. This deep dive has really allowed us to explore how our source material presents John Lennox's argument linking atheism to historical atrocities, and then, well, systematically critiques that very argument. We've unpacked Pires' analysis of how atheism is defined, the historical examples used, and the rhetorical strategies Pires believes are in play, contrasting them with his own views on the actual causes of historical violence.
It's a really clear example, isn't it, of how history is marshaled and interpreted differently in these ongoing debates about belief systems.
Absolutely. It really highlights that. And considering how historical events and figures like Stalin are used in these kinds of modern debates, and reflecting on the source's argument that dogma plus unchecked power is the actual common thread in atrocities. What does this analysis suggest to you, our listener, about the real practical lessons history might offer us for building a safer and more just society, regardless of anyone's specific belief system? Something to think about.